Hello and welcome to Coming Home Network Presents, where we have conversations about the kinds of things people think about when they're exploring the Catholic faith and wondering if they should become a part of it. I'm Matt Swaim, and today we get to talk about an interesting sort of angle on conversion pipelines. We'll talk about we'll call it the Evangelical to Anglican to Catholic pipeline. It's a thing. Some of you are only on this episode watching it because you are part of that pipeline or have been at some point. This is a production of the Coming Home Network. Come visit us at CHNetwork.org. We also have an online community that you can plug into, and we'd love to walk with you along the way as you ask questions and discern God's will for your life. That's community.CHNetwork.org. In addition to that, we also are completely supported by Partners in Mission. And if you want to join them in that effort to keep us putting out great stuff for free for the people who are looking for help, go to CHNetwork.org/compass. I'm excited today to talk to Andrew Petiprin from the Spe Salvi Institute. They're online at spesalviinstitute.com. And Andrew is sort of like Exhibit A of what this looks like to go from sort of the evangelical to Anglican to Catholic thing. Andrew, thanks for being on the show.
So good to be with you, Matt.
All right. So I'm trying to think about the best way to start this. I will say that when people ask us at the Coming Home Network, what denomination is it that usually produces the most Catholic converts? I usually say it's kind of like a toss-up between the Baptists because they're so far away and the Anglicans because they're so close. Mm-hmm. And we've interviewed plenty Baptist to Catholic converts and plenty Anglican to Catholic converts, but we've interviewed a whole bunch of people who were in some sort of form of evangelicalism, did a stop at Anglicanism, and then ended up Catholic. So I want to kind of address that because I feel like that's a unique sort of track. And I'll start just by asking you, like, what's your original Protestant pedigree? Like, what's the first kind of place that you found Christ?
Yeah, well, I was kind of I don't know what you'd say, a pan-Protestant, I guess, for a number of years. I was baptized in my grandparents' living room as a baby. So we did practice, pedo-baptism. I was baptized by my grandmother, my grandparents' retired Presbyterian minister friend. And I think he was in one of these sort of a branch of Presbyterianism. I'm not even really sure which denomination it was. I don't think it's one of the kind of mainstream ones.
Yeah,
nowadays.
Marcus calls those the split peas.
Yeah, it was one of those for sure. And a really nice man. I knew him a little bit growing up. But anyway, so baptized in my grandparents' living room. And but my parents, when I was very young, went mostly to Methodist churches. So we went to Methodist churches. My mother had been Southern Baptist, and then she became an Episcopalian as an adult. But then my father had been kind of Presbyterian and not much of anything, but didn't like the Episcopal Church. He didn't like anything that felt too Catholic. So Methodism was kind of a nice, kind of compromise for them. But they were never particularly wedded to the denomination. Like we went to Methodist churches, and I'm glad that we did because it was very formative for me. I mean, I learned all the great Wesley hymns and stuff like that just as a kid. But we eventually went to some other kinds of churches too. We went to a Presbyterian church for a while. And then when I was 13, my parents got divorced. My father was stationed abroad in the Navy, and my mom kept us in Florida where we were living. And then this was like kind of 1993. So at this time, we started going to what by today's standards is nothing like a mega church, but back in those days was kind of like a mega church. I mean, it was in an old Lowe's warehouse building, and it had been a Baptist church where, one group wanted to kind of do things a little hipper and more contemporary feeling and whatever. And so they created this new church, and we started going there. And so for basically my middle school and high school years, that's where my mom took us. So, but I have to say, and I don't know if you want me to stop there, but that is where I became a little disillusioned with church stuff because I don't know. I was a reader. I was into art and culture stuff. And I really found that lacking big time in this church community. So anyway, so a bit of this and a bit of that as far as my kind of, Protestant background goes.
Just for my own edification, how old were you in 1993?
I was 13.
Okay. Wait, you and I think, are the same age.
I think we maybe have figured that out before, Matt. Yeah, I don't know. So
Yeah.
I was 13 in 1993.
Okay.
Yeah, I turned 14 at the very end of that year.
So yes or no, that environment was both the place that you got excited about Christianity and you got disillusioned with Christianity.
Yep, absolutely, 100%. I mean, the youth group when we first started going there was incredible. I mean, it was just like packed with kids. It was fun. Like we went to conferences and stuff, and the music. I mean, even though I was already kind of a music snob by then, but I still felt it still felt kind of exciting. And there were actually kids from the youth group. I wasn't really one of them. I played guitar a bit, but there were kids who were actually fairly good musicians who got to play on the stage at services and stuff. And it felt really cool for a while. And then when I was about 16, 17, it began to feel really not cool at all anymore.
So you are telling the story of almost every person who has listened this far.
Yep.
I should also point out that 1993, I believe it was 92 or 93. I think it was 93 was the year that Tooth and Nail Records was founded, which is the kind of major underground Christian label that launched folks from like MXPX to, a whole bunch of other these bands that are really starting to try and figure out, how do we get beyond like sort of the polished version of hip Christianity into sort of the actual edgy Christianity.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of that, a lot of this discourse going on. And I think, at least for me, this is where I started turning, because I was always a reader too, where I started kind of, I was working at a family Christian store starting in my mid-teens, mid-high school. And this is the era around that probably 17 years old era where I was like, I don't think I want to read any living authors anymore in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
I started to really get into dead people. I was playing in bands and stuff too, and I found that living authors didn't come up with poetic enough stuff to base like punk rock lyrics off of, right? I didn't find that you could come up with cool stuff out of like Narnia and Middle Earth to name your band after, and you couldn't do that with like, forgive me, like Chuck Swindoll or like or Max Lucado. You couldn't come up with cool metal song inspirations out of those books. So that's at least for me a part of where I began to turn from this sort of pan evangelical world towards more of like a Anglican ish preference. But I'm wondering where that and how that happened for you.
Well, so when I graduated from high school, I went away to college, and I was very much in a kind of spiritual seeker mode. And I ducked my head into a few different Christian things. I think I went to an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship meeting once. I did not like it. I didn't go back. I went to a kind of liberal Presbyterian church a few times. And then I went to kind of a different liberal Presbyterian church a few more times. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, Matt, but it was at this church that I met Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers from TV.
What?
Yeah. So I went to the University of Pittsburgh. I'm from Florida, but I went away to college in Pittsburgh, and I was just sitting. I felt this. Well, I'll bracket what my real kind of spirituality was at this point, which was kind of a solitary Christianity. But every once in a while, I'd really feel the need to go to church, and so I would go to this kind of liberal Presbyterian church. And one day I was there, and there was Mr. Rogers right in front of me. And he came and sat down next to me, and he asked me what I was majoring in. And I said,
took his shoes off.
He didn't take his
into
shoes
a different
off.
Set of shoes.
It was almost like that though, Matt. It was so incredibly welcoming. And, he wrote, I told him my last name, Petiprin, and he said, "Oh, Petiprin, that sounds like Petit Prince, like the Little Prince." And I was like, "Yes, the Little Prince, yeah." And so he wrote a French quotation on my bulletin from the Little Prince, like just an incredible man. And so, but this was right at the end of my time in college. I think it was actually my last or second to last semester. And it was right before he stopped doing his TV show.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. So
were you like, Mr. Rogers, and who is my neighbor?
Yeah,
you could have just.
We never got into that actually, but
man,
he was so generous to me. I met his wife Joanne, and we sat together in church a bunch of times. But I was still
he was friends with Henry Nouwen, I believe.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, Yeah, I mean, but I was still kind of keeping church at a distance at this point. So I would go, and mostly I would go because I would hope to see him. But and he was often there, but he would travel a lot and stuff like that, so he wasn't always there. But anyway, that was very interesting for me and very powerful and formative. But I honestly didn't like the church experience there all that much. So I finished. All through this time, though, during my years in college, I was reading C.S. Lewis all the time. And I started picking up more things like St. Augustine, Thomas à Kempis, like kind of devotional classics and stuff. And I would just read them by myself. And I still felt very convicted of the claims of Christianity, especially in kind of the C.S. Lewis vein of like lunatic, liar, or Lord. Like I felt like it probably had to be true. But I really wasn't all that interested in exploring the kind of ramifications of what that meant, especially in terms of like liturgy and worship and church going and stuff like that. But so I finished college with that mindset, and I have a feeling I probably would have carried on that way a while longer. Who knows how long? But I got a chance to go to England to study in England. I won a scholarship, the British Marshall Scholarship, to leave to go from my undergrad to England, to Oxford. And that was not at all in my plans. I majored in French, and I kind of wanted to go disappear into Europe for a while, like go to France and just, drink wine and eat baguettes. And
be a little
whatever.
prince.
Be a little prince, yeah. But instead I went to England. And when I got there, I went to my college chapel. I met some people who were involved in kind of the chapel life. That my college, Magdalen, was the same college as C.S. Lewis, which I had applied to because of Lewis. And when I got there, I knew nothing about kind of the worship life of the place or anything like that. But this was in 2001. And amazingly, I discovered that there was still this like daily round of services and stuff that happened there, that every single night there was a professional choir of men and boys that sang a service, evensong, which I had never really heard about, except maybe kind of passing references in like the letters of C.S. Lewis or something like that. But I was totally captivated by it. And I started going every single night. And I thought, I can't believe people don't come to this. I mean, this is just so beautiful and so wonderful. And one thing led to another. I met a good group of friends. I became friendly with the chaplain, and I ended up getting confirmed in the Church of England that year. And maybe I should pause there and sort of then begin to tell you maybe about how long then that relationship lasted. But yeah, that's how I ended up an Anglican, basically.
Yeah, if you were to look on the shelf behind me and zoom in, you would find Anglicans galore who were super formative for me in that era. Of course, Lewis is the easy one. Any Chesterton I was kind of consciously plugged into was me thinking of him as an Anglican. Dorothy L. Sayers is all over this shelf, right? There's even some Madeleine L'Engle, some Frederick Buechner, of course, T.S. Eliot. Joseph Pierce always likes to joke, T.S. Eliot was an Anglo-Catholic from Missouri. And, when asked why T.S. Eliot never became a Catholic, Joseph jokes that he exhausted all his powers of conversion when he became an Englishman. Right? There's a certain sort of like English, I don't know what it was that sort of attracted me to this sort of like gift of language, to this sort of sense of chivalry, the sense of kind of like mystery and wonder that was somehow missing from the evangelical world I was in. And like you, I don't think I connected this to a liturgical expression. So for instance, there's this line, and I want to say The Weight of Glory. Maybe it's The Weight of Glory, where Lewis says something to the effect of, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object that will ever be presented to your senses. And I was like, I don't know what that means, but it means that I should really love my neighbor a lot more than I'm doing right now. What is a blessed sacrament? Like, I have no idea what this is. So when I was thinking about Lewis and some of these things, I had no connection to the sacramental life, no connection to a liturgical life. And I'm wondering if you had any of that before you went to Oxford.
No, it's pretty much the same. I was thinking of that very quote that you just shared. So that's why I was smiling, because thinking back to reading and rereading. I read through Lewis like a lot in these sort of solitary Christian years when I was an undergraduate, and it never even occurred to me. It never even occurred to me to sort of like go find out what is he even.
What kind of church he went to?
Yeah. I did know that he was like I guess I knew that he was an Anglican, but I wasn't total. And I knew that my mother had been an Episcopalian and that there was a kind of a connection there. But I didn't think about like Blessed Sacrament. What is that? It didn't really even occur to me to think about that. But as soon as I got into the Church of England, I discovered a lot of that, because this group of friends that I made in the college chapel were kind of high churchmen. And as far as I was concerned, it only took a month or two to where I had a pretty robust vocabulary of Catholicism, sort of. Things like Blessed Sacrament were very much things that this group that I was hanging around with talked about. And to your point about, I never heard that Joseph Pierce insight about T.S. Eliot, but I felt very much the same way. I felt like where I was at in my life was, I was still an American. You can't ever, you're always going to be, what you were. But I was committed to. I thought I'm going to stay here the rest of my life, and I don't want to just be, I don't want to just be a kind of foreigner. I want to be like part of this place. And I met a few Roman Catholics, a few Catholics along the way while I was there. And I even met Walter Hooper, who had been the executor of the C.S. Lewis estate.
Previous Journey Home guest. Yes.
Yeah, right. And I've gone back and watched his episodes. They're great. But, the narrative and especially at Magdalen, which was Lewis's old college, the narrative there was kind of like, this was something I encountered with a lot of people who had been Anglican and become Roman Catholic, was that there was a kind of a hint of sort of sadness about them. Like, and this was very much what Archbishop Michael Ramsey said about John Henry Newman, that his conversion was a tragedy. It's like they just didn't quite, like they should have stuck with it. Like they really had everything they needed, and they really didn't have to do it. And so, like, I remember when I met Walter Hooper, it was kind of like, that's too bad. It's too bad that he sort of went over. So those years when I was in Oxford, those couple years, and then 1 year after that in London, where I was beginning to contemplate a vocation to ministry in Anglicanism, becoming Roman Catholic was not. It really didn't seem to fit that life. Being Anglican made a lot of sense.
Yeah, Catholics are sort of Johnny Foreigner, as Lord, what's his name would say from Downton Abbey. Can I ask you a question that might be a little uncomfortable?
Sure.
Is it, I'm not going to lie. We're not going to edit this out no matter what you say. But when you joined the Church of England, coming from your rock and roll worship world, did you feel special? Did you feel enlightened?
Oh, yeah.
Did you feel like you had an intellectual and liturgical and historical leg up on those plebes over at the megachurch reading worship songs off a projector? Did you feel like you were now like a little bit above them?
Absolutely. And in fact, even in England, because in the Church of England, there are actually, in the Episcopal Church and in Anglicanism in North America, there's a lot less variety. It tends to be a kind of Catholic-ish expression in terms of liturgy and stuff like that. But in England, it's way different. I mean, there are, at least then, and to some degree, I think still, but I mean, in Oxford, for example, there were these two Anglican churches, St. Ebbe's and St. Aldate's, that were, if you walked in there, it would feel kind of like, and I mean, it's still English, so it doesn't feel full-blown American megachurch type thing, but it definitely didn't feel anything like, choral evensong at Magdalen College, Oxford, or the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., or something like that. I mean, it felt very, very evangelical, complete with praise band and all that kind of thing. And boy, howdy, at our college chapel, did we feel superior to those guys. No doubt about it. And honestly, Matt, honestly, my whole time as an Anglican, which sum total was about 18 years, one of the difficulties was feeling like I would have to leave behind this statelier, more thoughtful, more sophisticated expression of Christianity. Now, I'm not going to lie.
Go worship with the Irish.
Yeah, and just go be part of the masses.
And the Mexicans and the Filipinos and the Vietnamese, and not with the proper English.
I hate to say it, but and I mean, it was mitigated somewhat because when I was an Episcopal priest, and maybe we'll get to this, but the main congregation that I ministered to for about 6.5 years, about a third of my people were West Indian. And so they were very high church, and we love that. But their way of being, I mean, everything was very, very casual, very and so to me, that was already kind of convicting that I couldn't be this sort of, Englishman type sort of
Oxford man.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, it was like just the opposite. So there, I guess I had a bit of a a bit of a preview there.
So before I move on to this next bit, when you went from that world of sort of pan-evangelicalism into the Church of England, did you get any pushback from your evangelical friends, nasty emails from them saying, why have you left the true expression of the gospel to go join the whore of Canterbury? Right? Did you have any of that in your world, or were people like, oh, it's just a kind of another sort of Christian?
Most of those people were way in my past by that point, honestly, Matt. And the ones that weren't were people who were seeking something else as well. So no. And in fact, and definitely that was the case with my family. Nobody in my family what felt put out in any way by where I was. It did, well, I don't know. I guess we'll save that for later, but that changed a little bit when I became Catholic, to be sure, but not the Anglican part of the journey. No, there wasn't a whole lot of pushback.
So there's a definite appeal here, and I want to try and get to some of this appeal and why it is, because your story is not an isolated one, and I'm sure you've talked to since this has kind of transpired, and since you've gone on this path, people who maybe have become Catholic later on, but maybe people who just did the evangelical to Anglican move. How would you maybe characterize what that appeal is like for someone who loves Jesus and wants to know him better, but feels like how would you characterize what that move from evangelicalism to Anglicanism is? Like, what do you think is happening there?
Yeah, it's tough because ultimately, when I left Anglicanism for Catholicism, the big question that I was trying to solve was the question of authority. But I did feel like becoming an Anglican helped me solve that a little bit. But it eventually created more problems than it solved. But it solved problems because of the fact that it felt a little more rooted in a historical expression of Christianity. And that helped me for a long time. But, eventually like Newman, it required a theory to stay with it. And, I like Newman, and like a lot of other Anglicans who become Catholic, I tried a bunch of different theories to figure out how to stay Anglican.
Try branch theory at all, or?
Oh, good heavens, yes. I mean, branch theory is
lay that out for those who haven't dabbled in that. What is that?
I mean, I would say branch theory is at the heart of a lot of other theories. I mean, I think branch theory. So branch theory essentially says that there was once one church, one Catholic church, and over the centuries, because of various cultural reasons, historical reasons, et cetera, there developed different equally authentic or more or less equally authentic expressions of belonging to that one church. So there was like a trunk of a tree, and over the centuries, there grew out from the trunk different branches, one of them being Roman Catholicism, which is sort of the largest and most impressive branch. But there's also an Eastern Orthodox branch, and there's also this Anglican branch. And those are really, at least to the Anglican adherence to branch theory, those are really the only branches that are worth considering. There maybe is
I've never met, by the way, an adherent to branch theory who wasn't Anglican.
No.
Just so you know.
Right. Right.
The only branch theorists I know are the Anglicans. So
yeah, I mean, Eastern Orthodox don't have the branch theory.
They don't have a branch theory.
No, and Roman Catholics. I'm only saying Roman Catholics, by the way, because this is the term of art that is very important to Anglicans who are trying to be Catholic. And maybe we'll get into that. But yeah, I mean, Roman Catholic, when I became Catholic, nobody had ever really engaged with that idea at all. And Newman himself, I wrote this quote down because I just didn't want to get out of this conversation without bringing it up. But Newman said about, he said this about via media, which is another theory we could talk about, but it very much related to branch theory. He called it the great theory, which is so specious to look upon, so difficult to prove, and so hopeless to work. And this, so that's where I was. I do think that there are people who become Anglican and who are not bothered by this problem, who for them it is enough just to feel like they do have some connection to antiquity through the Book of Common Prayer. And my goodness, I mean, a point that I've made to people is actually the more modern Anglicanism has become until very recently, I would say, when they've made some real innovations in moral teaching that is obviously incompatible with the teachings of the early church or any connection ecumenically to the Roman Catholic Church. But I mean, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, the rite of Holy Communion in there is almost identical to the Catholic Mass that you would experience in most Catholic churches in the world. So in a strange way, Anglicanism feels more Catholic than ever, or did, at least until maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So, I totally get it that there are people who just, if they want to feel that authentic connection, they feel okay with that. But once you start reading and think, you really end up wrapping your mind, sort of getting caught and having to figure things out.
So I'm gonna, while we're throwing out different kind of theories and ways you tried to make this work,
Yeah.
I found that there are a few different kinds of ways that people join Anglicanism from evangelical backgrounds. I had a lot of friends who kind of went Anglican. They were sort of my kind of progressive Christian friends who went Anglican because it was more artistic, among other things, but also more sort of socially liberal. And they were leaning more kind of artsy and socially liberal. And a lot of those people are actually agnostics now, interestingly enough, and sadly enough. I had other people who were going sort of the more historical liturgical track and are still kind of marinating in that, branch theory type of people, or they've just sort of stopped the line of questioning at a certain point and they're like, we're not going to ask any questions beyond this question because we don't want to, we don't like where those questions might lead. But then there's also some people who are like, I feel deeply like a tractor beam is drawing me to the Catholic Church, but I will ruin relationships. I will disappoint my parents. I will freak out my seminary classmate. I'll do all this stuff if I become Catholic. So we're going to split the difference and be Anglican. And some of the people who I knew who are in that world split the difference, as it were, in their minds. And I don't want to read their souls or anything, but they would articulate it sometimes as, I'll just be Orthodox or I'll just be Anglican. I wonder, did you encounter those various streams, or was there maybe another kind of evangelical to Anglican path that you encountered along the way that maybe I'm not bringing up here?
I mean, just for myself, I felt both of those first two for myself. Not that I was like super duper socially liberal, but I was kind of left of center rather than right of center, I suppose, on some of those things when I was in my teenage years and in my early 20s. And I was very comfortable with the fact that Anglicanism, even in 2001, stuff like that wasn't a big issue. I mean, the fights were really brewing big time at that point, and I should have known that there was a lot coming that was going to create new kind of break points or whatever. But you don't know when you're kind of going through it. So that was one. Yeah, the historical liturgical for sure. I'll say this though, one thing that kept me, well, there are a number of things that kept me in Anglican. Certainly, once I was ordained, there were several things that kept me in. One was, I've talked about this before. Well, maybe let me put that aside for a second and talk about sort of where I was when I was just sort of becoming Anglican and things that kept me going with that, up to and including when I was in divinity school, when I was in seminary training for ordination, because then I really felt like, okay, I really do have to decide, because I'm gonna make vows. I'm gonna say that this is where I want to be. So I really do need to feel good about this. So by this point, the kind of some of the social liberal stuff had worn off a bit. The historical liturgical stuff still felt really good. And I definitely felt haughty about the fact that if I wasn't Anglican, I would have to sing bad music and, et cetera, et cetera. But the third thing was I was around some people who were really, really smart, who had engaged with these theories and who still felt okay with them. And so I backed off for a little bit, including, a couple of really smart seminary professors that I had who still sold me on this idea of Via Media as this, not this sort of in-between milquetoast kind of not Catholic, not Protestant, but some kind of comprehensive expression of Christianity. So I was okay with that. I tried to be okay with that for a while longer. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm trying to, I got a little distracted.
You kind of did.
Okay.
No, I think this is a really great place to take the conversation, because once you feel that appeal to Rome, I guess maybe the question to ask here is, what was it that began to turn the ship for you? Sort of, I hate to say Rome because Roman Catholic is like a pejorative,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
branch theory was towards the I don't know, the Petrine branch,
yeah, yeah.
as it were.
I think I said this on the journey home. So before several years, a few years before I even was kind of in the ordination process in the Episcopal Church, I had just come back from England, and it was when John Paul II died. And I remember just watching on TV the funeral, then the election of Pope Benedict and all that stuff. And I remember at the time pausing and thinking, whoa, this is different. This doesn't feel like just a big branch. Like this feels like the real thing. And I kind of feel like I'm playing pretend. So this was a little bit of a moment for me where it was like John Henry Newman looking in the mirror and seeing a Monophysite, where it's like, I think I'm close to orthodoxy, like I'm close to the real thing, but there does seem to be a problem with me saying I'm in, but just kind of a little different. Like it felt like a very different thing. That said, and everybody that I've talked to who took some time to eventually come from Anglicanism into, especially people who are ordained, they have multiple places like Newman where they wake up and then they go back to sleep again. It's like where they have to just like something pops up and then they push it back down again for a bunch of reasons. But that was a really big moment for me. And that never left me.
I can't remember if it was Newman who said it. I think he expressed a sentiment something like this, where he would say, if Irenaeus were to pop into the present day, he wouldn't probably go up to you and say, excuse me, where can I find the nearest Church of England?
Right.
Right. It
Yeah.
would be what the church fathers would recognize as, they would be using different criteria to measure which church was the legitimate heir to what they had been guarding and passing on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that was something I continue to struggle with, that very thing. I started reading some Newman, and especially then when I was in divinity school, we read Newman, but, and God bless these people. I'll just go ahead and drop one name. I'm sure he's probably not even listening. My patristics and Anglican theology professor was a man named Christopher Bealey, who is a giant patristic scholar. I mean, he is an incredible thinker. And he was one of the main people who sold me on the idea of stick with Anglicanism. And he had a very particular view of John Henry Newman, which was, he felt like, and I'm just going to say this is my memory of it. I would love for him to be on here and refute what I'm about to say.
If you're watching,
so yeah,
I'll get you Andrew's address.
Yeah, Christopher, if you're watching, remind me of why I'm mischaracterizing you. But my impression the impression that he always gave for me of Newman was that Newman was doing bad patristics, that Newman's view wasn't accurate. And there are other people who share that view. I came to understand that lots of people don't agree with that view, or that it's sort of nuanced, or whatever it may be. But the point that I'm getting at with this mentor of mine, Christopher Bealey, was Newman was great until 1845. So read Newman's sermons while he was an Anglican, and he was an incredible thinker on the question of Anglicanism, but he went the wrong direction, and so I avoided Newman, post 1845 Newman. I read the Apologia Pro Vita Sua during this period, his great autobiography, and I felt okay. It didn't bowl me over and make me feel like I had to run to Rome. And so I kept down that path in Anglicanism towards ordination in the Episcopal Church. It was years into my ministry that I reread the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and this time it affected me totally differently. And I felt like I knew sooner or later, and it was probably 3 or 4 years after this, but I knew that sooner or later I was going to follow Newman's path, that there was not going to be any way to deny it.
You mentioned having that sort of feeling of sadness around those Anglicans who become Catholic. Oh, that's a shame.
Mm-hmm.
They were doing so well up until 1845, right?
Yeah.
In the case of Newman. So let's maybe kind of go back and see if there's like parallels in these experiences, or maybe big contrasts that maybe tell a story here. And that is that, how would you characterize the feelings you were feeling as you felt convicted to become Catholic, compared to the kinds of feelings you were feeling when you were feeling the draw from evangelicalism to Anglicanism? Was it a similar kind of feeling? Was there any overlap? Did it seem like this is a familiar feeling to me, or did it seem like this is something kind of new and different?
I would say in a very general sense, in both circumstances, it was a feeling of finding what I had been looking for. I do believe that. And I felt like I had, in a sense, come home in both instances. However, the process of becoming Catholic was truly agonizing. And I mean, and just
in a way that Anglicanism wasn't, right?
No, not in the least. No. For one thing, becoming Anglicanism wasn't. Look, I think I may have said this on the Journey Home show too, or I've certainly said this in other contexts, but becoming, you know this so well, I know, Matt, but like becoming Catholic is so much bigger a deal than becoming an Anglican. I mean, even if you're going to a church where a guy is standing in vestments and holding up a little round flat piece of bread and all that sort of thing, that's fine. But becoming an Anglican really is a whole different thing. Why? Because, again, I'm dropping Newman all over the place here, but I mean, again, Newman was so right when he said the one organizing principle about Protestantism, whether you're a Baptist or a high church Episcopalian, is not Roman Catholic. I mean, it just is. And so when you become a Catholic, like your whole life from how your sin is dealt with, right? That was not at all a concern of mine when I became an Anglican. I wasn't worried about that. Like I knew I didn't have any problem with the idea of sin and forgiveness or whatever. But the idea that like there was venial sin and mortal sin, that I needed to go to confession, that there was some real sense that a human being standing in the place of Christ was going to pronounce that forgiveness to me. It's like it's crossing a river. I mean, that's why sort of we use the kind of metaphor, right, of swimming the Tiber or whatever. But it really does feel like that, like you've crossed over to some totally different place. And so the agony was not just that, dealing with those kinds of questions. But by the time I became Catholic, I was married. I had 2 kids. I had my entire livelihood was rooted in continuing down this path. And listen, Matt, as far as it goes, you know, talk about like the haughtiness that I felt or whatever about being an Anglican and not like those people. I mean, I was kind of a star in, I mean, I hate to say this, but like, I mean, my career was going really well as an Anglican minister. I had moved from being a parish priest to being on the staff of a bishop, like basically becoming what we call in the Catholic Church.
You were like a vicar general or something like that?
Kind of like a vicar general. Yeah. And
in Tennessee, right?
In Tennessee. Yeah. And in what was then a kind of conservative-ish diocese. You know, we were real proud of ourselves that we were kind of holding the line in this way. And in a strange way, because we were a little bit different, that we were sort of holding the line on some of these like moral questions, it actually brought more attention to us. Like we were able to write things and broadcast a little bit and stuff in a way that kind of got us a little bit more attention. Anyway, that's a whole other matter. But yeah, it was a way, way bigger deal. It was a way, way bigger deal to become Catholic, for sure, than to become Anglican. That's the long way to put it.
Yeah, I want to address that because, you know, you mentioned you felt like you had sort of risen above the common man, the common evangelical man, when you made that trajectory, and really light bulbs are coming on. And these are good things that you were learning, incredible things that you were learning, things that are part of the great Christian patrimony. I mean, we got popes who've read C.S. Lewis, right? And Robert Benson and some of these other folks. Now, just a little bit of my own story. I never did a stop off in Episcopalian or Anglican places. Part of that is because, you know, I was from Central Kentucky. There wasn't a lot in terms of options. And by the time all this stuff started coming to a head in my life, I wasn't looking for a church that had the name of another country in its title. I was looking for the church. So the Church of England was out, you know, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. I wasn't going to go to any of these national churches. It was off the table for me. And I had kind of resigned to the idea that all this freedom in the world wasn't going to do me any good if it just put me up in this upper echelon with this group of people who were only capable of making rational assent to these like principles of Christianity. So in a sense, I kind of got knocked down a bunch of pegs when I finally decided I was going to become Catholic, because it's like the whole James Joyce line, "Here comes everybody." I was like, I had been baptized United Methodist. My family then went to the Church of the Nazarene. Again, we were going wherever the service was great, and we liked the preaching and the whatever. Nazarene's a little bit smaller group. We went to the Free Methodist. I've talked about this before. Even smaller. I was hanging out with a bunch of house church planting restorationist dudes. It was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we were getting the tighter and tighter group of the guys who really got it within what Lewis would call the inner ring, right, of the people who really got Christianity. And suddenly I'm just getting thrown into the pew with every Catholic. They drew a line around my zip code and said, "You guys are all going to church together." Right? I'm reminded of what Oscar Wilde says, and I knew I was not going to get out of this episode without sharing this quote, where he says that the Catholic Church is for saints and sinners alike. For respectable people, the Church of England will do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It suddenly was like all that desire to be sort of respectable and part of this sort of really educated, smart, clever Christianity. I kind of had to let a bunch of that egotistical pursuit of the faith go and just go to mass with all the rando Catholics who lived in my zip code.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that's a good jumping off point to address one thing, which is one of the things that we do miss a lot, my family anyway, is kind of the smaller church environment. We were definitely not looking to be in a house church or to preserve a faith that, was only practiced by the only, the 5 real faithful people on the planet Earth or anything like that. But we like the idea that our community, that we were known and loved. And then, when I was a pastor in that kind of thing, it was great to kind of have our whole lives focused on the people that we did church with, we went to church with. We have not had that experience very much as Catholics. We belong to the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter. And we do feel that when we're able to get to an ordinariate church. However, the closest one is about an hour away from where we live. So we are technically members there. And I work in a church, and we go to mass in different places and stuff. And we're good. I mean, we're good. We feel good about being Catholic. We have some Catholic friends and that sort of thing, but it's not the same. It's not the same as it was when we were Protestants. And that's just a kind of, that's just something that we're going to have to live with. And that's something that I say to people who are contemplating coming in. I do say to them, like, just know there will be a kind of sadness that you have to live with that might be connected to that. Maybe not, but maybe so. And it's not on that point, it's not a snobby thing. Like, oh, I have to go to church with all these, anybody and everybody. It's just a question of, you go to a parish with so many people that it's just a little harder to be connected,
Well, but I think it's a pain that almost every convert feels if they have self-selected, whatever church they're going to, because, and I think I mentioned this before as well in some other of the shows that we've done, is that until I became Catholic, I had no idea how homogenous the churches that I had gone to my whole life were, because it was all people who liked a certain kind of preaching, a certain kind of music, were making a certain kind of amount of money, had kids around the certain age, all had like the similar musical and political and consumer preference. It's all the same. And Anglicanism has this in spades, right? Anglicanism is just notoriously upper middle class white people. It just is, right? Yeah. And this has been the case for so many people who come into the church. In some ways, they're like, why doesn't the Catholic Church have a better way of making everybody get along? Well, guess what? When you went to church with those people that you went to church with before, you already got along with them before you ever walked into the door, because you were all the same kind of people. Whereas in the Catholic Church, it's like, it's everybody, man. And here's the thing, that what I've come to appreciate, which is sort of a deeper and abiding joy over this, is that if my church can't handle every kind of person, then it ain't the real church.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not. And I'd rather be part of the real church than just a group of people who can sit around in our bubble and pat one another on the backs and be like, isn't this a nice community?
Yeah. And I'll just say from my own experience in the Church of England, I didn't feel as much like it was just being in a club, because it's still the established church, and so it didn't feel like sort of just one denomination among many. But back in the States, immediately, I discovered I had to just try always to stay focused on the fact that being an Episcopalian meant I was part of the worldwide Anglican communion and that I was connected to the Church of England or whatever. But it was hard, because once I started ministering in the Episcopal Church, I did realize that you are basically ministering to people who have self-selected to be there and not somewhere else. They're there because they don't want to be or can't be in a Catholic church. They're there because they don't want to be or can't be in a Baptist church, etc. And so, and just a shameless plug here, I have a book coming out in a couple of months from Catholic Answers that's called The Faith Unboxed, and it was originally called What the Catholic Church Is Not. And because each chapter I use a particular word to kind of address like something like what we're talking about, and I have a whole chapter about why the Catholic Church is not a club. And thank God it's not. It's not. But a lot of churches, a lot of other ecclesial groups, unfortunately, do. It just kind of inevitably they do kind of feel like that.
Yeah. I like to say that Catholicism is the thing you have in common with people with whom you have literally nothing else in common.
Yep.
Right. It's kind of a wild and miraculous thing in some ways, the way that the Catholic understanding of baptism, the Catholic understanding of what communion means, can bind together people who would have no other reason to be in the same room together. It's a beautiful thing. It's an incredible thing, and something, again, by the time that I was really ready to make a move, I was looking for the church, not a national church. But if people have listened this far, it's either because they have gone through these stages and are Catholic and they're reminiscing and thinking, oh man, this is bringing back memories, or because they are on the evangelical to Anglican part, but not to the Catholic part yet. And maybe they're going through what you were talking about, and what a lot of the people who've come to us through the Coming Home Network have talked about, many of them clergy, which is just this sheer terror, right? And just playing the tape forward in their brains about all the chaos it's going to cause in their families, all the hurt letters they're going to get from friends, everything that's going to show up on their social media feeds by making this decision. Like what's a piece of encouragement that you give them? Because once you made this decision, it wasn't like everything was like sunshine and roses for you either.
No, not at all. And yeah, by the way, thanks to everyone who has listened this far. I appreciate your attention. But the whole, okay, so the grass isn't greener. People will say this. People said this to me. The grass isn't greener in the Catholic Church or anywhere else. And I said, no, I know. I mean, I would just strongly encourage people to understand, especially if their livelihood depends on it or their identity as a kind of minister in a Protestant community. There's going to be pain associated with that, and yeah, you're walking into an organization that has been racked with scandal and will continue to. And by the way, I think we may still be just at the beginning of that, honestly. But okay, it doesn't change the fact that you're coming into the fullness of truth. And when anybody ever asks me what my regrets are, sure, there are certain regrets, but there are no regrets whatsoever about the decision to become Catholic. Zero. There are all kinds of things to work through, and disappointments and whatever. Yeah. But it's just like Newman talks about. I mean, it was like for us, for our family, like a ship coming into port from rough seas. So I would tell people who are contemplating this decision that it is the right one. As a priest mentor, a Catholic priest mentor of mine said shortly before I came into full communion with the Catholic Church, he said, the Catholic Church can be perfectly awful, but it's the real deal. And that I have never wavered on that. It's the real deal. That same feeling that I felt when I watched the funeral of John Paul II, this sense of, whoa, this is real. I still feel that way 100%.
Yeah. I can't remember who says this, but the concept that you're not going to fix the Catholic Church when you join it, but you're also not going to break it. Yep. You're not going to break it. Nope. And that's kind of maybe the last place that I want to go with this is, you got eyes wide open on this stuff. You see all kinds of dumb headlines about either, priests behaving badly, bishops behaving badly, people who phrase things in a way that you would really rather them have phrased it another way. Like, it's just a hot mess everywhere. But how would you maybe characterize how you feel when you see a frustrating headline in the Catholic Church, as opposed to when you saw those kinds of things swirling around in the Anglican communion? Like, does it hit different when you see those controversies pop up as a Catholic than it did when you felt that there was some kind of bad news item about Anglicanism when you were in the Anglican Episcopalian world?
Oh, absolutely. It's night and day, especially because, as I said before, Matt, I was a part of this little group within American Anglicanism, and especially within the Episcopal Church, that felt like we had this special mission back to this larger Episcopal Church. Like we were going to reform it. We were going to kind of fix it. And so what that meant was trying to get elected to things like General Convention, trying to get in the room where votes were taken or where we could get to a microphone and basically rescue the faith from people who were trying to wreck it. And now I just think that's just ludicrous. It's so ridiculous. Like I have no anxiety whatsoever. I seriously don't. And I know that there are Catholics who do, who are like, oh my goodness, we're heading in this direction. We're heading in that direction. And yeah, I mean, there are moments when I look at certain things and I'm like, that's kind of tiresome. But I don't feel any of that anxiety that I felt when I was an Anglican. It is not up to me to save Catholicism, as you just said. It's not up to me to fix it. It's there. The teachings of the magisterium are not going to be thrown overboard. They're just not. And that just continues to be, for me, just a complete comfort. And honestly, at this point, Matt, there was a time maybe when I was a little more active, for example, on Catholic Twitter and kind of saying, well, here's my opinion about this, or here's my opinion about that. I tend not to do that much anymore, just because I every once in a while I do about things like films and soccer teams and stuff like that. But when it comes to church stuff, I just kind of am like, the faith is the faith. It's the real deal. It's not going anywhere. And if somebody wants to come talk to me about it, I'd love to talk to them about it. But there's no need for me to weigh in on this or that statement or anything like that.
I'm content to do dad jokes and fishing and baseball tweets most of the time. I mean, I don't want to punch above my weight.
Yeah.
What's the psalm about? I want to be like a weaned child on my mother's lap. Not concern myself with things too big for my pay grade, as it were.
Yeah.
But since we've been talking about kind of trust and hope, I know that you work with a project that is named after a papal encyclical on hope. So before we let you go, why don't you give us a plug for what you're doing with Spe Salvi?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Matt. Yeah, I have a lot of balls in the air, as it were, for various things that I do. But my former colleague from when I worked at Word on Fire and my good friend Bobby Mixa, he and I, for a number of years, we wanted to think about a way that we could talk about cultural things, art, kind of not so much politics, but just sort of the way the world looks as we look out on it, with theological lenses, but not kind of nerdy theological lenses. Like, really try to get our heads around how, in the West anyway, we are going to be able to kind of carry on with our faith as the basis of our society. And so anyway, we've both been really captivated by the great encyclical by Pope Benedict XVI, Spe Salvi, Saved in Hope. So when we left our positions at Word on Fire, we just kind of threw up a website and began making podcasts and putting some articles up. And the Spe Salvi Institute was born. We both still do lots of other things because we have to make a living, but we've really enjoyed just having interesting guests on, having little conversations, publishing some articles. And we have a lot of other stuff, hopefully some pilgrimages, some study tour type stuff that we have in the works. So yeah, I'd encourage everybody to check out our website, spesalviinstitute.com, sign up for our emails, and they can find our podcasts where we've talked to a bunch of interesting people, which reminds me, Matt, we haven't talked to you. We need to have you on.
You can talk to me right now.
But
I talked to you first. Yeah. I got to break the ice on this.
Well, yeah.
All I can say is that if you're into like Ratzinger and Giussani and Tolkien, you'll probably enjoy what you find over at the Spe Salvi.
100%. Yeah.
All right, man. Well, we got the link in the show notes. I'm going to encourage people also. We've got a link to some other things that you've done with us through the Coming Home Network, including your Journey Home episode, where if people want to get more of like the narrative chronology of how this played out, then definitely go check out Andrew's stuff. Andrew, so grateful that you spent a little time with us. This is such a unique kind of journey, but it's also kind of like a weirdly common trajectory. Mm-hmm. So thanks for giving voice to it today.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Matt. So thanks for having me on.
All right. And thank you for watching this episode of Coming Home Network Presents. We'll talk to you again soon.